an expression of the creative cosmic force, where all creative acts are infused with that energy, where that energy, in a way, is a driving force, whether this manifests itself in a beautiful composition of music or painting, or a breakthrough in scientific realm, or some kind of revelation in terms of the spiritual realm. All this is, we could say, without exception, have that energy at its core. Managing sexuality from a shame-based, in brackets, Islamic culture. Background: I'm a 26-year-old male struggling immensely with containing sexual energy. I grew up in harsh conditions in Afghanistan where, being a shame-based culture, sexuality was the ultimate taboo. The ultimate taboo. I was 11 years old when I saw for the first time a young woman wearing shorts on the plane towards Australia. My mother, in a desperate attempt to save me and my brother from, in brackets, shameful thoughts, quickly covered our eyes with her hand, saying, "Don't look." Later in Australia, the pendulum of my sexuality has often swung from one extreme, puritanical repression, to the other, indulgence, and I've struggled to find the balance. It was in one of those pendulum reversals that I lost my virginity to a prostitute. Believing that I had committed an unforgivable sin, I carried this shame and guilt for years until coming across your channel, which has alleviated that shame to a degree. Questions. And there are two questions. How to be a strong enough container for this creative energy so as to be able to handle and withstand the transformative process. I have been following your teaching on YouTube for the past year and a half, and I have heard you say that there needs to be an initial build-up of prana to kickstart the transformation of consciousness. And second question, I suspect that there is still much shame I carry within me that is preventing me from reaching a point of balance on this topic. Your thoughts and guidance on handling sexual energy as a young single man with the intention of transforming consciousness is much appreciated. Okay, well, very important topic and very, very important questions. So, before answering the actual questions directly, I want to just reflect on the background, which I totally understand what you are going through and why there is this shame. And as you very, very eloquently and very, very clearly put it, that pendulum that swings between the extreme of puritanical repression and indulgence is to reconfirm rather, because I can see that you have that understanding, that any opposite, when we are effectively speaking unable to appease these extreme forms, extreme opposites, create a greater degree of that pendulum. So this can be seen also in terms of the struggles on a level of what many, classically speaking, cultures share, particularly with regard to the attitude to sexuality that can be found running as a red thread throughout all Abrahamic traditions. So it's all strung through in a way that runs as a red thread in that sexuality. And that sexuality is of course, inseparable immediately from the original sin, in other words, the fall of Adam, from that shame and guilt that the body represents per se. Already the body represents in its kind of certain interpretations. I'm not saying that all metaphysical interpretations necessarily share that perspective, even within the given traditions. But theologically speaking, there are common grounds that were reinforced by a continued reinterpretation into the 21st century, where the body itself is seen as a place where all that shame and guilt is already a dwelling place because of what body represents in terms of all its unquenchable desires. And these desires is represented by that, let's say, flesh, right? The spirit fallen into the flesh, that spirit weighing heavily by the fact that it's coated in flesh. And of course, we do our best to pierce this through with the clarity of understanding, even often borrowing the examples from the given traditions as to posit ourselves in such a way so that we can see that all this is subject to both metaphysical and spiritual interpretations. So in other words, it depends on how theologians have interpreted this, is what instructs us in a way. And then, of course, we carry that within our genes as well to a large degree until we are freed from that material effectively when we are becoming to rise in consciousness. Because with the rise in consciousness, the all-encompassing view begin to dominate our perspectives and dominate our understanding. Of course, the utmost, let's say, expression of that, what I still call ignorance, is when it is coming from the perspective which breeds all forms of radicalism, fanatism, and all the extremes, which in itself is simply an expression of that utmost, let's say, inertia, in Sanskrit, tamaguna. So even if awakening taking place when, let's say, someone whose mental field and impressions dominating by this tamagunic repository, which tamaguna dominates, then the awakening itself will be colored, and this could potentially create a zealot, a fundamentalist, a fanatic. And I did speak about it, and it's very, very well known out there in the, let's say, inside the spiritual discourses, that awakening itself is not always just flowers, or not always just clinical experience of, let's say, what we speak of very often in the context of this, when we give the umbrella of energetic transformation of consciousness, right? Activation of prana, the Kundalini process. There's also the energetic components of how that awakening can be colored by what dominates, let's say, prior to that unleashing of the energy. In the one in whom sattvic qualities dominate, then awakening would be always, as it were, accompanied by very benevolent factors. Even if some, let's say, challenging aspect will be thrown in, they will be much easy overcome. If one's field is dominated by activity of rajaguna, then of course it will cause a lot of excess fire, heat. One would be fried by one's desires and passions, in addition to what this represents. And tamasic awakenings, of course, are known for what I mentioned just a moment ago, prone to slide immediately into this conclusive perspectives, which are on par with reinforcing, in a way, one's notions that one already holds on to dearly, and that breeds the most undesirable kind of all awakenings. The awakening, which, effectively speaking, would have been better without. One would be better without. But going back to what you have shared here, I want to reassure you that there's nothing wrong with that, what you're experiencing to begin with. I'm first saying that there's nothing wrong in the fact that you're experiencing this shame, right? It's like I would advise you to detach from it in a sense that it belongs to the cultural, let's say, collectively shared consensus, which you simply being part of inherited without even having a choice, without having anything to say about this. But now that your life taking the trajectory of traveling, seeing the world, being exposed to different cultures, right, in a more cosmopolitan way of life, and what's most important is that you are interested in these matters. You are on the path of self-realization, on the path of freeing yourself from these all these accumulated impressions. So there's nothing wrong also in losing your virginity to a prostitute either. I just want to comment on that. If this is, perhaps this might be helpful for you. Yes, we all desire to have, and in our maybe kind of like more of that preference, that our first sexual experience should be pure, based on love, mutual attraction, right? That purity, that whatever is associated with that. Of course, that's desirable, but I would say that in our day and age, it's almost impossible. I'm saying almost impossible. Majority of us are simply go along in this jungle of life, and because of such intertwining of all the dharmic, let's say, interactions of all the dharmas, that following that kind of pure path here, as I said, is almost impossible. On the other hand, prostitutes are not to be considered as impure beings. And I want to maybe bring some clarity in terms of spiritual dimension of various kind of archetypes. And when we speak of women who are forced to, or trained to, brought up to, or have by virtue of, let's say, survival, enter that profession and become prostitutes, I want you to see this from the esoteric angle of that. And believe it or not, prostitutes, right? All those who give themselves to the job, to the profession of satisfying someone physically, right, are being guarded and protected by Lakshmi herself. So in other words, the archetype in the tantric pantheon of the 10 most important Shaktis, goddesses, Lakshmi extends her patronage over the profession of which we speak right now. So in other words, whatever may seem at the face value of social acceptability here as being, perhaps, if not lowest of the low, but certainly low down there in terms of the social strata. We don't want to have that association. It's not something that we want to uh, boast about or parade, or it's something that is considered to be, yes, like, if one have that encounter, one would not be willing to bring it out into the open. Um, Certainly not in terms of that what is considered to be acceptable social form, but from the esoteric perspective, prostitutes here are belonging to the realm, which is very important, historically, traditionally, always have been. And you'd be surprised how many men and women, perhaps, I don't know, more, this is probably in relation to men, lose their virginity to prostitutes. In the past, I would argue, in more tribal societies, it was a way of life. The virginity men would lose would not be lost in the virginity of another bride, a woman, but it would be lost, as it were, to the company of an experienced female who would, in a way, initiate young men into this, equipping them with a certain required understanding, down to hygiene, down to etiquette, down to, let's say, introducing them to the, even if to the basics of that lovemaking. Of course, I'm speaking about it, maybe something like kind of, jumping somewhere else with it all. But I just wanted to bring this so that we understand and don't brush it all with the same brush of shame and guilt. And with that, we also dismiss all this. And immediately, as soon as I said that, I don't want to be misinterpreted as a disclaimer. I'm not speaking about porn industry here. So let's not confuse and, mix apples and pears, and someone will be throwing it up on me that I was rehabilitating, let's say, porn industry. Porn industry is one thing. It's a horror. It's a horror, literally. It's a horrendous, terrible, despicable, the way women are treated, and men, in terms of what that industry is. And what I'm responding to here is purely to the subject of prostitute women who entered that path to make money, to make a living by providing pleasure, even if this is just a physical pleasure of flesh only. Dare I say, in the eyes of different cultures, this have always deemed to be noble profession. Noble because it was understood in terms of its indispensable role in the society, place in the society it held. So that not everyone have a fulfilling sexual life with a partner or in a marriage. Not everyone can have that. At the same time, there are a lot of lonely people. At the same time, the profession of prostitution has almost overlaps the territory with the arts, crafts, and education. In ancient Greece, this profession was the highest order of heteros, and these heteros would be a trained female, selected painstakingly, going through the almost academy level of training, where they will learn to dance, sing, recite poetry, hold a conversation, not just on worldly topics, but able to speak about politics, able to speak about even philosophy. And these heteros would be kept by very, very wealthy noblemen in a warrior class, usually, not necessarily. Some of them made fortune for themselves. Some of them made name for themselves. The analogy of that is geisha in the Japanese culture, not to be confused with maika. Geishas are artists, never, never spoken with disregard, let alone contempt. So why when I'm speaking about this? So I want you to also rehabilitate yourself from these like shameful thoughts that you lost your virginity to a prostitute. At the face value, it may seem like a dirty act, right, out of desperation. But there is also a hidden dimension, and you as a spiritual aspirant should always be able to see the unseen, hidden dimension, metaphysical dimension. So this is why I'm sharing that. Now, more specifically to the questions that you brought, right? So the second set of questions, kind of tying what you have built in the first, that you suspect that there is still much shame that you carry within yourself that preventing you from reaching a point of balance on this topic, right? And you're asking me to share this, right? Oh, how to handle guidance on handling sexual energy. Well, rule of thumb, not to separate sexual energy from creative cosmic energy of the universe. Seeing it all, even that immediate impulse, strong physical impulse felt localized down there, or maybe localized, not just localized, because it can be experienced in different way. With someone it feels very localized. With others it may feel like the whole being is like every pore, every fiber, every cell uh, is charged with that energy. Not to be seen as just something there, either reserved just for procreation or pleasure, or pleasure, but an expression of the creative cosmic force, where all creative acts are infused with that energy, where that energy, in a way, is a driving force, whether this manifests itself in a beautiful composition of music or painting, or a breakthrough in scientific realm, or some kind of revelation in terms of the spiritual realm. All this is, we could say, without exception, have that energy at its core. There are helpful understandings to see this also, and Osho wrote about this, spoke about this, to see this as sex, right? Love and God, right? Like the mapping it, overlapping it, let's say, on the spiritual anatomy, as the lower chakras, the heart center, and the centers of transcendence, right? The heavenly realm. All these about different degrees of expression of one reality. At a lower level, sexual energy is how that absolute expresses itself, and that is its language. At an intermediate level that holds it all together, it's expressing itself as that feeling of utmost intimacy we call human love, love between two beings. Also, not just reserved to love between two beings. Love that parent experiencing towards a child has that same very energy, but it took a different form. It's now taking a different form. And ultimately, the love of which, said effectively speaking, which transcends it all. So that same energy here is that what Osho in his Sex, Love and God outlined this, like mapping it out. We could say that when that energy falls back onto itself. But throughout all these three mega forms of expression, it remains to be, but one indivisible reality of the absolute and how it self interacts with itself. So, sexual energy meant to be cherished, meant to be used in that way, understood to be and related to be in that sacred way. So you need to go back to that sacred understanding, rediscover it within yourself. I would even go as far as to say, to impress you, a mere fact of erection is not just a physical act which requires some release. It's a primitive understanding. It means that something is alive and full of vitality. It means that there is this something that is expressing itself at that particular level. Yes, in the younger age, it is perhaps dominating at that level, when our awareness is literally pulled down to the groin. And that in itself has to be also worked with, understood, embraced, because unless it is embraced, one would always fight against it. Whatever we fight against only increases itself because it is being refused to be understood and embraced. Or if we shun it down, if we try to suppress it, then it's even worse. We know the cases of suppression in Abrahamic traditions express themselves in a continued way, in the most ugliest way possible. And these babies' corpses, I mean, the secret cemeteries within the monasteries where unwanted babies were born is a confirmation of that, how in Christianity in particular, the aspect of sexuality was never understood, was fought against, and no one was unable to fight that creative force of the universe. So the same is in Islam, of course. The same is in many other cultures. So this is fighting against sexual energies, fighting against one's own very self expressed at that level. It's not a fight we can ever win, but we can certainly assist the process of sublimation. And I always say that to sublimate that energy is to consciously become a creator in whatever field of enterprise we can, and let alone when we feel a calling. Because that language, that what is experienced, let's say, as an intensity down there, is at the very same time what drives all creative processes. So on one hand, impotence is also impotence, not just at the sexual level, it also translates as creative impotence. So excessive expenditure of that energy is likewise results in all forms of exhaustion, and particularly exhaustion on the level of that where we need to remain aware, conscious, fully present, so that our awareness is not burdened by that sluggish physiological, let's say, way of how we feel on any given day. So, of course, this is where we enter the territory of sexual hygiene, knowledge, understanding, knowing our abilities, capacities, knowing our constitutional setup, knowing what to do, how to do it. All this is part and parcel of truly wholesome work on a spiritual path for both male and female. So this is what I wanted to reflect most immediately to what you have brought out into the open. Okay? So just make that departure, put aside that shame, kiss it goodbye, just Embrace and accept this. That's how it is. That's the way you were meant to be initiated into this realm. This is the way you unfold. This is the way you go. Okay? Nothing is shameful about any of that, what you have related here. Know that. Know that and be free from wasting energy into where you could apply it in a much more productive and wholesome way.